Have you ever started a massive journey? Maybe a huge career move, a big relocation, or a major life change, and just deeply regretted it the exact second things got hard? We have all been hangry before, right? But let's look at what happens when an entire community hits their absolute breaking point. It's the 15th day of the second month after leaving Egypt. They've arrived in the desert of Sin, resources are running low, and the entire camp just begins to panic.
Listen to the incredible psychology behind their complaint. The Israelites literally cry out, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Wow. Talk about a severe case of selective memory. They are romantically looking back at a deeply toxic past of captivity simply because they're uncomfortable and scared in the present. They are literally trading the reality of their newfound freedom for a total fantasy version of their past.
Part 1, Grumbling in the Desert and Hitting the Breaking Point.
Now, this existential panic is directed squarely at Moses and Aaron, which sets up a massive leadership challenge. Moses actually has to step back and tell them, look, who are we? You aren't grumbling against us, you're grumbling against the Lord. But here's the wild part. Instead of punishment for their complaints, the people's fears are met with this extraordinary divine intervention. The Lord promises a daily rhythm of provision designed specifically to prove his presence, meat at twilight, and bread from heaven in the morning.
Sure enough, in the evening, quail come and cover the entire camp, totally satisfying the promise of meat. But the next morning, that's when things get weird. The dew clears, and they find this mysterious substance all over the desert floor. The Israelites look at it and literally ask, "What is it?" Which, funny enough, is exactly what the word manna translates to. The text is super vivid here. It describes thin flakes, kind of like frost on the ground, white like coriander seed, tasting like wafers made with honey. Basically ancient frosted flakes. It perfectly meets their physical needs. But as we're about to see, this miracle comes with a very strict set of conditions.
Moses is essentially operating as a highly stressed middle manager here, relaying that this daily bread is actually a test. The rules are clear. Step 1. Gather only what you need for today, about an omer, or roughly 2 liters, per person. Step 2. On the 6th day, you have to gather a double portion. And Step 3. Rest completely on the 7th day. Do not go out to gather. These steps are a masterclass in breaking a scarcity mindset. The people absolutely have to trust the daily process.
And we get to see exactly what happens when you mess with those rules. When people acted out of fear and tried to hoard the manna overnight on a normal day, it backfired horribly. It filled with maggots and smelled awful. But when they saved it overnight specifically for the Sabbath, exactly as commanded, it remained completely fresh and safe to eat. It's this undeniable physical manifestation of obedience versus fear-based hoarding.
But human nature always kicks in. It just shows us how incredibly hard it is to break free from panic. Despite those very vivid, very smelly consequences, some people still tried to cheat the system. Some even went out on the 7th day to gather, fully expecting to find manna, but they found absolutely nothing. This prompts a really direct rebuke from the Lord, asking, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands?" The provision is always there, but the absolute hardest part for the community is learning the discipline of trust.
To put the sheer scale of this divine provision into perspective, 40 years. The text explicitly tells us that the Israelites ate this manna for 4 exact decades. They ate it continually as they traveled from place to place, right up until they finally reached a settled land at the border of Canaan. So this wasn't a one-time magic trick, right? It was a decades-long sustained survival mechanism.
All right, Part 4, Water from the Rock, the Mutiny at Rephidim.
We can trace a frighteningly rapid escalation here in this next phase. Point 1, they camp at Rephidim, but there is 0 water. Point 2, the people instantly start quarreling with Moses, accusing him again of trying to kill their children and livestock. By point 3, the situation is so toxic that Moses cries out to the Lord, literally saying, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." It goes from a logistical issue to a full-blown mutiny. Finally, point 4, God instructs Moses to strike the rock at Horeb, which miraculously produces water for everyone.
Because of this, Moses names the place Massa and Meribah, since the Israelites tested the Lord. And this highlights the core psychological issue at play here. They actually ask, is the Lord among us or not? Think about that. Despite the daily miracle of the manna, despite the quail, just a moment of extreme thirst instantly drives them back to foundational doubt. Their physical environment is completely dictating their spiritual and psychological reality.
While they are still dealing with the aftermath at Rephidim, the Amalekites attack. So suddenly the crisis shifts from environmental, hunger and thirst, to active existential warfare. Moses realizes pretty quickly he cannot handle this alone. What follows is a brilliant division of labor to ensure they survive, and frankly, it's a profound lesson in teamwork and preventing leadership burnout.
The actual mechanics of this battle are fascinating. Joshua is tapped to lead the men down into the valley to fight with swords. Meanwhile, Moses, Aaron, and Hur hike up to the top of the hill. Moses is holding the staff of God. The text tells us that as long as Moses holds up his hands, the Israelites win down below. But human endurance has limits. Whenever he lowers his hands out of sheer exhaustion, the Amalekites start winning. The fate of the entire battle is directly tied to the physical stamina of one single guy. It is an incredibly tense dynamic.
And here is the absolute crucial turning point. When Moses' hands grow too tired, they take a stone and put it under him to sit on. Then Aaron and Hur literally hold his hands up, one on each side, so his hands remain steady until sunset. Moses literally could not win this battle by himself. It's such a great reminder that even the strongest, most capable leaders have a breaking point. They need a community around them to physically and emotionally support them, to hold their arms up when they just can't do it alone anymore. Because of that support, Joshua wins the battle.
Surviving all of these successive crises, the hunger, the thirst, the war, it naturally results in a need to document the journey. God commands that these events be remembered. Moses instructs Aaron to put a daily portion of manna into a jar and place it with the covenant law for future generations. Also, after the battle, Moses builds an altar and names it, "The Lord is my banner." These are physical touchstones. They're built to make sure the people never forget the divine provision they received and the massive power of their unity.
Looking back at this epic cycle of struggle and provision, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. We all face our own wilderness experiences, right? Our own moments of scarcity, our own intense battles. So how do you remember your survival through the tough times? And maybe more importantly, when you hit your absolute limit, when your own strength completely...
So picture this. We find Moses out in the harsh wilderness, specifically set up near the mountain of God. And out of nowhere, he's reunited with his father-in-law, Jethro, who's the priest of Midian. But Jethro doesn't show up alone. He actually brings Moses' wife, Zipporah, and their 2 sons along with him. Once they settle into the tent, Moses just unloads. He recounts the entire epic story of Israel's escape from Egypt, all the hardships, dealing with Pharaoh, and the ultimate miraculous rescue. And Jethro is just absolutely delighted by all of this. He declares that this God is greater than all others. He offers burnt sacrifices and then sits down to share a meal with Aaron and all the elders of Israel. It paints this really warm picture of calm, familial restoration right before the crushing burdens of leadership come rushing back. But before we move past this reunion, the text highlights something I find absolutely fascinating: the names of Moses' 2 sons. Their names literally establish the entire backstory leading up to this wilderness camp. The name Gershom translates to, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land," which totally captures the feeling of exile. And Eliezer means, "My father's God was my helper. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh," perfectly summarizing the rescue. So in just 2 names, the entire historical context of what they've just been through is brilliantly captured. Well, that peaceful family reunion we just talked about, yeah, it doesn't last long at all. Because the very next day, Jethro observes a critical, and honestly a highly relatable flaw in how Moses is running this newly freed society. At this point, Moses is acting as the one and only judge for every single dispute among the people. He takes his seat at the crack of dawn, and people just stand around him waiting until the sun goes down. He has become a massive administrative bottleneck. The proposed solution, which we'll see, is to have Moses handle only the absolute toughest cases and delegate the rest. It's a perfect illustration of making the leap from total chaos to sustainable governance. So Jethro is watching this exhausting process unfold, and he immediately points out the sheer absurdity of a one-man show like this. He pulls Moses aside and asks the ultimate leadership question: why do you alone sit as judge? How on earth do you expect to govern an entire migrating nation entirely by yourself? And Jethro really doesn't mince words here. He tells him, what you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. In what is essentially the ancient world's first recorded session of management consulting, Jethro is delivering a stark, necessary warning against executive burnout. If Moses keeps this pace up, both he and the people are heading for a total collapse. To fix this organizational nightmare, Jethro lays out this brilliant 4-step delegation plan. Step 1, Moses needs to remain the primary representative before God for the major high-level disputes. Step 2, he needs to proactively teach the decrees and instructions so people actually know the rules. Step 3, and this is absolutely crucial, he has to select capable, trustworthy men who fear God and hate dishonest gain. And step 4, delegate all the simple, everyday cases to them. And here is how that strategy builds out into an actual working framework. Jethro suggests dividing the massive population down into groups of thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10s, and putting an official over each one. So what we're looking at is the creation of a highly organized, completely scalable judicial hierarchy. The everyday, simple disputes get handled at the local level by the leaders of 10s or 50s. Only the most impossibly complex cases escalate all the way up the chain to Moses. And the text tells us Moses actually listened. He implemented the whole system, and just like Jethro promised, the strain was lifted, allowing everyone to just go home satisfied. Now that the earthly administration is finally organized and humming along smoothly, the text takes a dramatic turn. It is exactly the 3rd month after leaving Egypt, and Israel enters the vast desert of Sinai, setting up camp directly at the base of the mountain. Moses goes up the mountain, and God initiates this monumental proposition. But before even laying out the terms, God uses some incredibly vivid imagery to remind the people of their dramatic rescue, saying, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." It's a beautiful, poetic reminder of the immense divine power that has protected them up to this point. Then comes the core offer. The text says, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." This is it. This is the central proposition of the entire narrative. It's an invitation to elevate the whole nation, taking them from a group of recently freed slaves to a holy, priestly status among every nation on earth. Moses takes this massive offer back down to the elders, and they unanimously accept, replying, "We will do everything the Lord has said." But an encounter with this kind of divine presence? It isn't a casual drop-in, because God plans to appear in a literal, dense cloud so the people can hear his voice. A strict 3-day countdown is initiated. Days 1 and 2 are heavily focused on consecrating and purifying the camp, washing clothes and abstaining from sexual relations. Everything has to be ritually pure, because on day 3, the Lord is going to physically come down onto Mount Sinai. You know that orderly, bureaucratic vibe from Jethro's visit in the previous chapter? Yeah, that is completely, utterly shattered on the morning of the 3rd day. The text just overwhelms us with these cinematic, downright terrifying sensory details. Imagine this. There's deafening thunder and lightning. A thick, ominous cloud descends. A trumpet blast sounds so loudly that the text specifically notes everyone in the camp trembled. Mount Sinai is completely covered in smoke because the Lord descends upon it in literal fire. The smoke billows up like a giant furnace, and the entire mountain begins to violently shake. Faced with this overwhelming, terrifying display of power, God commands Moses to establish severe, unbreakable boundaries. The instruction is incredibly explicit. Be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. The sheer, raw danger of this unfiltered divine presence requires strict physical limits placed entirely around the base of the mountain. Moses is told over and over to warn the people and even the priests not to force their way through the boundary just to look. And the penalty for breaking this boundary, it is brutally explicit. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows, not a hand is to be laid on them. Just touching the mountain means instant death. In fact, the person becomes so dangerously contaminated by the contact that they can't even be touched by an executioner. They have to be put down from a distance with stones or arrows. No person, not even an animal, is permitted to live if they cross that line. So this leaves us with a pretty wild final thought to ponder. We started this explainer looking at a very pragmatic, very human problem, setting up a chain of command, delegating tasks, organizing a society into groups of 10s, 50s, and thousands. But how does a newly structured society, fresh out of middle management training, manage a relationship with a force this unimaginably terrifying and powerful? How do you govern daily life when your covenant partner is literally a consuming fire on a violently trembling mountain? It completely redefines the stakes of their new civilization. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.
Now, the first set of these commandments is entirely vertical. right? They are strictly focused on humanity's relationship with the divine. The text outlines the exclusive worship of a jealous God. A God who punishes sin, sure, but who also shows immense love to 1,000 generations of those who follow him. There is a strict ban on creating idols or images. You literally cannot misuse God's name. And then there's the Sabbath. This is a mandated day of absolute rest. No work for anyone, not you, not your kids, not your servants, not even your animals. It's basically a hard reset for the entire society every 7 days.
From there, the text pivots horizontally to the rules of society. We see a clear shift from divine worship right over to community order. It starts squarely within the family unit. Honor your parents. Then it lays down the ultimate boundaries of human interaction. No murder, no adultery, no stealing, no false testimony. And finally, it actually addresses internal desires, forbidding the coveting of a neighbor's property or spouse. These rules, they form the absolute bedrock of their societal boundaries.
The Israelites stayed at a distance, just trembling with fear. They actually begged Moses, saying, "Speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us or we will die." Moses had to step in and reassure them. He explained that this terrifying display was really a test. It was designed to instill a deep, reverent fear of God that would basically stick with them and keep them from sinning.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how quickly the text moves from that massive, terrifying cosmic event down into highly specific practical rules for ancient worship architecture. If you were going to build an altar, it had to be acceptable. And an acceptable altar was incredibly basic, just earth or undressed stones. What was forbidden? Dressed stones. If you used a chisel or a tool on the stone, the text says you defiled it. Also, you absolutely couldn't build an altar with steps. Why? Because walking up steps in ancient flowing garments could expose your private parts, which was strictly forbidden in this sacred space.
This ancient text, let's look at the standard legal life cycle of a Hebrew servant. If you bought a Hebrew servant, they labored for exactly 6 years. Then, in the 7th year, a massive reset happens. The servant goes completely free without paying a single thing. But there were complications. If the master gave the servant a wife during those 6 years and they had kids, well, that family remained the property of the master. When year 7 hit, only the man went free, leaving his family behind.
So what happens then? What if this servant loves his wife and kids, or even his master, and just refuses to leave? The law actually provided a legal mechanism for this. The master would take the servant before the judges, bring him to a doorpost, and physically pierce the servant's ear with an awl. This was a permanent physical mark. It signified a voluntary, legally binding choice that the servant was giving up his 7th year freedom to serve his master for life out of love.
The text also neutrally details distinct protective stipulations placed on fathers who sold their daughters as servants. The law ensured these women retained certain rights. If the master was displeased with her, he had to let her be redeemed. He absolutely could not sell her to foreigners. If he gave it to his son, she had to be treated like a daughter. And if he took another wife, he couldn't reduce the first woman's food, clothing, or marital rights. If he failed to provide those things, she walked away completely free.
So the crucial point is that this society operated on a stark matrix of proportional justice. A fatal blow, put to death. But if you knock out your slave's tooth, the slave goes free. If a bull gores someone to death, the bull is stoned. Or say you uncover a pit, leave it open, and your neighbor's ox falls in and dies, you pay the owner the full price of the ox, but you actually get to keep the dead animal. It's a highly transactional, practical legal system.
The law was also sophisticated enough to distinguish intent. Premeditated, deliberate murder resulted in a guaranteed death penalty. The text emphatically states a deliberate murderer is to be dragged away even from God's holy altar to be put to death. No sanctuary whatsoever. However, if the killing was an accident, completely unintentional, the perpetrator was allowed to flee to a designated place of refuge to escape immediate retribution.
Interestingly enough, murder was not the only capital offense. The text lists other crimes punishable by death, and this really reveals what the culture valued most: family hierarchy and personal freedom. Striking your parents, death penalty. Kidnapping someone, whether you sold them or kept them, death penalty. Even cursing your father or mother carried the ultimate punishment.
But what about non-fatal fights? Say 2 people argue, and one hits the other with a stone. Liability depended entirely on recovery. If the victim was confined to bed, but eventually got up and walked around outside with a staff, the attacker wasn't charged with murder. But they were strictly liable to pay the injured person for their lost time at work, and they had to cover all the medical costs to ensure complete healing.
The text also reports on the harsh realities of slave ownership laws. If an owner beat a slave with a rod and the slave died immediately, the owner was punished. But if the slave recovered after a day or two, the owner faced no punishment.
The legal justification, written right into the text, is, quote, "since the slave is their property."
So, when you have a society where people are getting into fistfights, digging pits, and owning slaves, things can get out of hand quickly. It begs a massive question. When serious injuries occurred, how did ancient law stop an endless, escalating cycle of violent blood feuds?
And this brilliantly illustrates the solution: lex talionis. While today we hear an eye for an eye and think of brutal vengeance, in its ancient context, this was actually a crucial legal cap on unchecked violence. It meant the punishment could never exceed the crime. If someone knocked out your tooth, you couldn't burn down their house in revenge. The justice had to be exactly proportional. It was a system of strict equity designed to limit collateral damage.
We see this concept of liability and negligence heavily applied to livestock, specifically goring bulls. If a bull unexpectedly gores a person to death, the bull is stoned, the meat is uneaten, but the owner is legally innocent. But if that bull had a known habit of goring and the owner had been warned but failed to pen it up, totally different story. The bull is stoned, and the negligent owner is also put to death, unless the victim's family demands a financial ransom to spare his life.
Now, if that exact same negligent bull gored a slave to death, the penalty was strictly financial. The bull is still stoned to remove the public danger, but the negligent owner was required to pay exactly 30 shekels of silver to the master of the deceased slave to compensate for the property loss.
What if a bull kills another bull? The ancient law provided incredibly practical solutions. First-time unforeseeable accidents. The two owners simply take the surviving live bull, sell it, split the money 50-50, and split the meat of the dead bull. Easy. But if it was a known goring bull and the owner was negligent, that owner had to pay full price, a live animal for the dead animal, though they did get to keep the dead bull's carcass.
We've journeyed from the terrifying, smoke-filled peaks of Sinai down into the muddy reality of ancient life. And while the specifics of goring bulls and all-pierced ears feel incredibly distant, the foundational DNA of these laws is actually still with us. Concepts like proportional justice, compensating for lost wages, distinguishing between accidents and premeditated murder, and liability for no negligence, those are the bedrocks of modern law. So I leave you with this to think about. When you look at how we settle disputes in our modern courtrooms today, how much of our sense of justice is still echoing down from that ancient shaking mountain?
What actually happens when your neighbor's ox wanders over and eats your crops? Or worse, someone flat out steals your livestock? It's a slightly humorous scenario for us to imagine today, but for an ancient agrarian society, an ox was literally your livelihood. It was your tractor and your bank account all rolled into one. Because the stakes were so incredibly high, these laws needed absolute, ironclad clarity.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the sliding scale of exponential restitution. Notice how the penalty shifts depending on the crime. If you steal a guy's ox and slaughter or sell it, boom, you owe him 5 cattle. For a sheep, you owe 4. But if the stolen animal is found alive in your possession, you simply pay back double. You see, ancient justice wasn't just about throwing someone in a cell to serve time. The explicit goal was to aggressively make the victim whole again, pulling directly from the offender's own assets.
The text also gets deep into the weeds of safekeeping and borrowing. For instance, if you borrow an animal and it gets stolen while the owner is away, you pay up. But what if a lion attacks it? This brilliantly illustrates how the law accounted for nuance and actual evidence. If the animal was torn to pieces by a wild beast, the borrower had to bring the physical carcass in as evidence. Present the remains, and no restitution is required. You literally had to prove you weren't just covering up a theft.
Transitions from strict property codes to some surprisingly progressive social safety nets, and it uses a powerful psychological anchor. Do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners because you were foreigners in Egypt. The crucial takeaway here is that this society's empathy wasn't just theoretical. It was explicitly grounded in their own recent, bitter historical trauma. They were commanded to remember their past to dictate their future compassion.
And because of that empathy, the blueprint outlines rigorous economic protections. Foreigners, widows, and the fatherless were fiercely protected classes. But look at the specific rules for the needy. If you loan money to a poor neighbor, you cannot charge them interest like it's a standard business deal. And if you take their cloak as collateral for a debt, the law mandates you must return it by sunset so they don't freeze at night. Human dignity completely supersedes financial leverage.
Impartially speaking, though, the source material reminds us that this was certainly not a modern secular democracy. It was a deeply strict religious state. The compassion we just talked about existed within some very harsh boundaries. Offenses like sorcery, bestiality, or sacrificing to rival gods were treated as capital treason, carrying the death penalty. Maintaining their unique identity and absolute loyalty was paramount to their survival.
The source text demands strict courtroom integrity through a really fascinating dual command. On one hand, justice has to be entirely blind to the sway of the angry mob. You absolutely cannot follow the crowd in doing wrong, and obviously no bribes. But look at the balance here. You cannot deny justice to the poor, yet you also cannot show favoritism to a poor person simply because they are poor. The law is demanding pure, unvarnished objectivity.
But justice wasn't just confined to a courtroom. It was highly personal. Look at how they were commanded to treat their actual enemies. If you find your enemy's ox wandering off, you have to return it. If you see someone who actively hates you struggling with a donkey that's collapsed under its load, you can't just walk by and ignore it. You must stop and help them. Everyday justice required individuals to prioritize communal stability and animal welfare far above their own petty grudges.
If there is just one single number you take away from this entire explainer, make it this one right here: 7. The number 7 acts as the fundamental heartbeat and the driving rhythm of this entire society.
The text outlines the Sabbath principle, which defines an incredibly radical economic concept for the ancient world. Every seventh day, all work completely stops, and the text specifies exactly why, so the ox, the donkey, the slave, and the foreigner may be refreshed. It instantly equalizes masters and servants. Furthermore, every seventh year, the land itself gets a break. It must lie unplowed so the poor and the wild animals can eat whatever grows naturally. It is mandated system-wide rest.
Alongside that weekly and multi-year rest, the calendar was punctuated by a strict timeline. The text commands all men to appear before the Lord for 3 major annual festivals. These festivals were perfectly mapped to align their religious gratitude and historical memory directly to the agricultural cycle of planting, first fruits, and the final harvest in gathering. Their whole concept of time was structured around nature.
Interwoven with this rhythm of time are specific ritual purity laws. The people were commanded to dedicate their firstborn sons and give their livestock on the 8th day. They were restricted from mixing the blood of sacrifices with yeast, and they were given the famous command not to cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Avoiding mixing life-giving milk with death visually and culturally set them apart as a designated, holy people.
We're zooming all the way out to the cosmic scale here. The end of this blueprint lays out a clear, step-by-step conditional contract. Step 1, listen to the guiding angel God sends and obey. Step 2, demolish the sacred stones and gods of the local inhabitants. If they do those 2 things, Step 3 triggers, God will defeat their enemies, bless their food and water, remove sickness, and grant them a full lifespan. It brilliantly illustrates the if-then nature of their national contract. Absolute loyalty results in absolute divine protection.
And the methodology for this conquest is super specific, using a really fascinating phrase: little by little. God says he will not drive out the current inhabitants in a single year. Why? Because the blueprint reveals a surprisingly practical strategy. If the land empties too quickly before the Israelites can multiply to fill it, it would become totally desolate and overrun by wild animals. The conquest is paced specifically to maintain ecological balance.
The climax of this text establishes massive, sweeping geopolitical borders for this new nation. The promised territory stretches from the Red Sea all the way to the Mediterranean, and from the desert right up to the Euphrates River. But it comes with a strict final warning. They are absolutely forbidden from making any peace covenants with the inhabitants or their gods. Adopting local religious practices, the text warns, will become a fatal snare that will destroy them.
When we step back and look at this entire text, we are seeing a stunningly complex society being built from scratch. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question. When we look at our own modern laws regarding property theft, our concepts of the weekend and mandated rest, and our empathy for the vulnerable, just how deeply have these ancient ideas shaped the very foundations of the societies we live in today? Definitely something to keep in mind next time you take a day off.
Thanks for watching.
Stay blessed and don't forget to share this video with everyone.